Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com, and today I'm here with Douglas Smith. Hi Doug.
Hi, Joanne. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Just a little introduction. Douglas is a multi-award winning Canadian author of novels, short stories and non-fiction, described by Library Journal as one of Canada's most original writers of speculative fiction. He's also the author of Playing the Short Game, How to Market and Sell Short Fiction, which is what we're talking about today. Very exciting. So, Doug, tell us a bit more about you and your writing journey, a little potted history, if you like.
Yeah, sure. So I guess appropriately enough, I did start by writing short fiction. I started in the late 1990s. I think I spent far too many months trying to write my very first short story. And I joined a writing group, which was sort of the incentive for me to actually get to a final draft. And I set out my very first short story, I think in January the next year, and I sold it about a year later. And that year was sort of just write, send, and submit, which was one of the messages in my book. But I started getting more sales. I started getting personal rejections, which sounds weird, but it actually is a form of validation for beginning writers. It feels so good that someone actually sends you something personal. I think what I found when I started writing was it was just important to get that feedback, that validation. And I just focused on short fiction for probably the first 10 years. And I found that my stories were getting longer and longer and longer. And I figured that was my subconscious trying to tell me maybe it was time to move to a novel. So about the 10-year mark, I actually published over the next 2 years. I published 3 collections. One was in French. We can talk about that later, foreign language for short fiction. And I started on my first novel. And now I will dabble in short fiction, but I'm pretty well focusing. My new words are going into novels, and I'm have one novel out, and I'm about 2/3 the way through an urban fantasy trilogy. So.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
That's where I am now.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's just get some definitions clear. So what is a short story or short fiction versus a novella versus a novel?
Sure. So I'm not sure how general these terms are, but in speculative fiction, certainly for the awards, things like the Hugo and the Nebula, etc., and most of the awards follow these guidelines. A short story is under 7,500 words, or maybe 7,500 words and under. But anyway, that's the limit of a short story. Mm-hmm. If you're between that and I think it's 17,500 words, that is called a novelette. And that tended to be where I found most of my stories are ending up. And the longer the story, we can talk about this later too, the longer the story, the harder it is to sell. And there's very clear business reasons for editors for that. And then a novella goes from 17,500 words up to 40,000 words. So technically a novel is anything over 40,000 words, but most publishers, traditional or small press, are not going to publish anything that short. You've really got to get up to, it varies whether it's YA or middle grade, but for adult fiction, you pretty well have to be at least 80,000 to sell.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because this is one of I wrote my most recent novel, Map of Shadows. I had thought I might submit it to a traditional publisher because it's a new genre for me. And then it came in at 60,000. And for me, that's about normal because I write really short. And then I was like, I can't be bothered adding 20,000 in order to submit it. So I'm like, yeah, great. And Dean Wesley Smith, who we both know, he writes around 60,000 as well, I think. So it is interesting how that changes. But why? So just coming back to you and short fiction,
Sure.
why did you focus so hard on short fiction? Like, what is it about short fiction that lovers of the genre or the form, I guess, love?
I guess I started out when I was introduced to speculative fiction as a kid. I read a lot of short stories. I just found as a reader it was a great way to discover new writers. The anthologies. There used to be, ever so many annual anthologies of the best of. Could be best of space stories or sword and sorcery. It could be anything. And one, I love the way that an author could tell what seemed like a complete story in so few words. But it's a great way to find new writers. Like you read a story and you go, oh, that's fantastic, and you chase down their other work. As a writer, I guess one of the reasons I started with short fiction, I think when you start out, you're not sure you can write. You're not sure that you're ever going to sell anything that you write. So to me, it was a good way to kind of test the waters. It's a great way to learn your craft. If you've written short fiction for a number of years, it doesn't mean you have everything in your writer's toolbox to become a novel writer, but you've got a lot of the necessary tools. So it is a good way to learn the craft of fiction, point of view and pacing and dialogue and setting and just ever so many. So I wanted to try to become a writer in a way also that I could test the waters. You find out if you're writing at a publishable level faster as a short fiction writer, because let's say we'll use the 80,000 word novel again. So that's probably anywhere from 16 to 20 pieces of short fiction that you could write if you wrote 80,000 words. So you can try a lot of different styles and narrative structures and formats and different points of view and multiple points of view, etc. You can try a lot of different things in the way of experimenting with forms of storytelling in 16 to 20 short stories. In a novel, you're stuck with whatever narrative structure you've selected for that particular novel. So I think you can learn how to write a lot faster. The basic core capabilities you need if you're writing short fiction than in a novel. And the other benefit is, as you finish a story, you send it out to market, and you start to get feedback. And if it's rejection, you probably need to keep writing. You haven't developed your craft enough. Although we can talk more about what's a reasonable number of rejections later on. But as I said, when I started writing, I got my first sale in a year, and I was getting personal rejections, and that is a form of feedback. Rejections are a form of feedback, especially when they start to get a little more focused and actually make comments on the story. Way to get into fiction writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And but you're not just a short story writer. You are a multi-award-winning short story writer. And I did, kind of want to, sort of honing in on the craft. What are your? Do you have any sort of tips for taking it up to that level? Because did you notice? Is it just literally a number of words or experience, or do you feel that there are certain types of stories that win awards?
Wow. It's tough. I mean, the only nonfiction book on writing I've done is quite consciously on the business side, not the creative side. I think it's very hard to teach creative writing, and I struggle with sort of answering that. I don't think you should try to say analyze what are the award-winning stories. You can certainly understand why they're good, and that helps your writing. But I don't think you should target, I need to write that kind of story to win an award. I think the award-winning stories tend to be, beyond being incredibly good, well-written stories, they tend to be all over the map in terms of the type of story or subject matter, etc. Probably the key is more once you have your story and what you think is a publishable form, how you market it, because the stories that are going to get award attention tend to be the ones that are appearing in the top professional markets. They get more eyes on them. They get more of the best of editors looking at them for sure. Anyone who's putting out a best of anthology for a year is always going to look at the top pro markets, the magazine markets, and the big the anthologies, and maybe some of the major collections. So that's the key.
Well, we'll come back to that, but let me reframe that question then to when you have an idea, how do you know that that is a good short story idea? So, for example, I've written a couple of short stories, but I've written far more novels of the 60,000. Right. And when I have an idea, I then look for ways to kind of slot that into a longer form piece. So when you get an idea around shorts, or when you used to write a lot more, how do you know it's a short idea, rather than something that would be a lot bigger?
I'd preface my remark by saying, every time I think, oh, yeah, it's 5,000 words, it ends up being 10,000, 12,000. But back to why I started novels. I'd say I'm a character writer, so I tend to start with a character. One of my favorite writers of all time in the speculative fiction, actually in any genre, is Roger Zelazny, the late American writer. He once said that ideas tend to come to him as a character, an idea, or an image. And the better stories were the ones where you got two of them at once. And I have to say most of my ideas come in one of those three forms. But I know whatever the first kernel for a story is, until I know my character or characters, I can't start writing a story. So I view sort of my story arc is the character arc, or the characters' arcs as they intersect. So I look at that and I say, okay, what journey am I going to take this character on? What is the initial problem that they're either facing or have been thrown into? And, what are the major events that are going to occur before that character can come to the end of that journey? And usually from that, I can for a short story, I can say, okay, I don't outline short stories anymore. I probably did at the start. I can't really remember, but I can usually figure out, that's these number of scenes, and typically that's probably going to be somewhere in a 3,000 word story or an 8,000 word story. So I guess that comes with experience. And then when I started writing novels, interestingly enough, I had the same problem. My first draft of my first novel was 160,000 words. Ended up being down under 120, but still fairly long. I think the more you write, and this is another reason I'd strongly suggest people, if they're thinking of getting into creative writing, to start with short stories. At least try it for a year, because you do get an idea of, after you've tried to write stories, and you have to finish them. That's the other best piece of advice. I think it's Neil Gaiman's favorite piece of advice. You have to finish what you write, because then you really do understand what a story is and whether what you've written is a story. Mm-hmm. The more you do that, you get a feel for that idea. Yeah, that's short story. That's not novelette length. Wow, that could be huge. Sometimes when you start a short story, you find that, well, I could go this way, I could do this, and it might grow into a novel idea. The other advantage I've found in short fiction is that it's a great way to explore novel ideas. Mm-hmm. My very first short story I revisited that set of characters 5 years later for the novel. And when you get to the point where you're marketing the novel, it's really good to have a short story that is the preface, the prequel to a novel too. So short fiction is another good way to explore ideas for longer works like novels, and also give you marketing tools. So I'm not sure if I directly answered your question. I think my only answer is start with short fiction, and you'll really get an understanding after you've written a few, probably at least a dozen. When you do get an idea, you'll have a better feel for whether this is a short story, or a novelette, or a novella, or maybe even something you could grow into a novel.
Okay, cool. So let's then talk about the markets for short fiction, because mm-hmm. it used to be very clear, like you said, you would write a short story, you would mail it to whichever magazine or editor, and you would get a rejection, or it might get published. But now, there's not just print magazines, there's digital, online magazines, there's indies doing, self-publishing short fiction. It seems like there's an explosion in possibilities for short fiction. So how do we know what is a good market, like you mentioned, a pro market, versus just another marketing mechanism, I guess?
Sure. So I might have to get a bit into licensing of rights here, but yeah, sure. So I hope I'm not taking this too much out of sequence, but it's hard to talk about where you should send your story first when I haven't discussed rights. So I think the most important thing for writers to learn when they're beginning is understanding the rights that you have to the intellectual property you're creating your story. And the most important thing to know is that when you're selling a story, you're not actually selling it. When a publisher wants to buy a story and publish your story, they're going to be licensing a certain set of rights from you for a certain period of time. And the publisher will try to get as many rights as possible for as low a price as possible. And you, as an author, in a friendly business, negotiation mode, should be trying to give them as few rights as possible. For as good a price as possible. You usually can't negotiate rates on short stories, but sometimes you will encounter situations where a publisher is asking for more rights than they need. Rights are, if it's a print magazine, they just need print rights. If they're asking for electronic rights, you can ask for that to be removed because it does possibly limit some of your future markets for reselling the story. But the most important right is what I call the occurrence rights. And the very first time you sell a story, you are selling first rights. You can only sell first rights once. That may seem obvious, but a lot of writers don't understand that. And first rights are very valuable because they can only be sold once. So because it can only be sold once, you should be trying to sell your first rights to a story to the best possible market that you can. And when I say best possible market, I go by the Science Fiction Writers and Fantasy Writers of America guidelines, which is pro market, means they're paying 6 cents US a word or more, which isn't great. I mean, you're not going to get rich at 6 cents a word. But it does define most of the top professional markets. So my first rule is when you're selecting a market, start at the top. Make sure you find a professional market, a market that has good cachet, so they appear on award lists a lot, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first rule, because flip it around. Let's say you sell to a for the love market or for copies or for semi-pro rate, and you submit to there and you sell it. You'll probably, when you get that acceptance letter or email, you'll probably be very excited, but your next thought might be, wow, if they bought it, what if the next market up could have bought it? Or what if that top market would have bought it? Maybe it's that good. And you'll never know. You can't send it to those markets anymore because they don't take reprints or what is called licensing second rights. So the top markets only want first rights. In other words, they want to be the first ones to publish your story. So if you already published it in a semi-pro magazine, you're not going to sell it to a top market ever. They don't do reprints. They don't license second rights. So my first piece of advice to all beginning writers is when you start to send your work out, do your research on the markets in your genre and send it to the top markets. You figure out what you want the top market to be, but there's a bunch that pay pro rates, and send it to them first. And if you're writing a lot of stories, it doesn't matter if they're taking 3 months to get back to you. You just send it out to the next one when you get back in, and just keep sending all your stories. Keep them in the mail is my main piece of advice on this. So that would be, and I've totally forgotten your original question. But
No, that's great.
That's how you start.
Yeah, so I guess my question was, like, you've defined there the top markets, those paying that, they want those first rights. But I guess if people are starting out, it's unlikely they're going to get, sure, send it to those. And if you get a rejection, maybe look at other options. And because many of my listeners are self-publishing, there are a lot of digital-only markets, but there are also indies now self-publishing to their audience. So writing short fiction and just publishing a story on Kindle or Kobo or wherever and sending it to their list. So not even going anywhere near the markets. So what are some of your thoughts on the sort of other options for stories and, any sort of pros and cons that you would consider?
So when I wrote the book, it was aimed at the beginning writer who is starting as short fiction. So there's no other incentive for them when they're marketing a story other than to sell that story to the best market they can. Indie author and you have perhaps, you've built a world, you've had multiple novels in a particular universe, or around that set of characters. I can see the logic in putting out a short story, indie publishing it as sort of a treat for your readers, and possibly as sort of a loss leader to attract more readers to that world. I can see that. But what I'm talking about in the book is someone who is starting out as a fiction writer, and I'm recommending the road of starting with short stories and marketing them to traditional markets. I don't mean big publishers. I mean the traditional top magazines and anthologies. And I still recommend that. If you're starting out, I strongly advise against indie publishing your short fiction. If you're just doing that to get the story published, you're just throwing away your work, in my view. You're not getting most of the benefits you could get from selling to a top professional market. You're not going to get award recognition or consideration. You're not going to build a resume if you're submitting a novel to even a small press later on and you just have a list of indie published short fiction. No one's going to be impressed, as opposed to if you are submitting to a publisher for a novel, and you have sales to some of the top pro magazines and anthologies, and you've hit award ballots, etc. That's not a guarantee they're going to buy your book, but it's a strong item in your favor that you're going to jump out of a slush pile and they might actually read your novel faster, which actually is a good thing. So you're wasting the chance at a resume if you're starting out in short fiction. So I'd say indie published short stories. Once it's in your backlist, in other words, the rights are reverted to you. I've done that with all of mine. Or if you have other reason, it fits into a marketing strategy that you have for your longer work, your existing longer work.
Yeah, and I really like that advice. It's funny. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to talk to you on the show was because I think for a lot of indie authors, this is actually a great way to, to get things into traditional markets in a less long. It feels that getting an agent, getting a traditional publisher for a novel these days is a minefield. Whereas for what you're saying with short fiction, you don't need an agent, right? You submit direct to an editor of a magazine, and then you do the contract. It's not a big contract. It's quite simple. Yeah. And it just seems to me, and then like I buy a lot of anthologies now too, and then you are being discovered by new readers who then might check out your novel. Whereas if for a novel, it might take you a year to get an agent, a year to get a deal, another year before it's out or whatever. So would you see that sort of hybrid approach with short fiction is, can be good for the marketing aspect as well as the sales?
Yeah, I obviously, I'm somewhat biased. I think there can be reasons to put out a short story indie without trying to sell it first, but I recommend that you do. So again, the only reason I'd put out a short story directly, indie publish it, is, for example, when I have this trilogy of novels published, if I come up with some short story ideas and I want to, I probably try to sell it to some of the good markets. But I might consider just putting that story out directly, maybe for my mailing list subscribers, and then that's a sort of a hook, hopefully, for them to get into the series itself. But other than that, I think you're just throwing away too many possible benefits of selling to the when I say traditional short fiction markets, it's not like the big New York publishers. Yeah. You're right. We can talk about how you can easily find markets for your short stories. You just email them now. You attach them, to an email, or you go through a Submittable or some sort of online submission system that the market uses. You'll get the email back with whether you've accepted or not. It's just so easy to do. And as you say, the contracts, and I cover this in my book, there are a few things you need to look for. I think there's about 8 different things I focus on in the book for short fiction contracts. But really, there's the top 3. And that's, what rights are you giving away? When do those rights come back to you? And a couple others, which escape my mind. But they're easy. They're not complex. And if you go through, that advice, or you've done it a few times, you quickly learn what to look for in short fiction contract.
And
the main thing is the rights come back to you.
Yeah, and that's what I like about the idea. And you mentioned 3 months for a sort of time frame. Would that be a normal time frame? If people were submitting, would they expect to hear back within that time frame?
It's sort of the average, or put it another way, and I had this from like Gardner Dozois, who's won more Hugo Awards and Nebula Awards for Best Editor than any other editor. He said it is appropriate to query an editor if it's been more than 3 months. So 3 months was pretty typical for the big magazines. You'll find some of them are a lot faster, some of them are a lot slower. I track submission rates. There's online tools that track the average response rate for markets. But 3 months is pretty typical. And if you think, wow, that's going to be a long time, I'm sitting around twiddling my thumbs. Well, no, you're writing more stories and you're sending them out too. So, don't worry about it. Get it in the mail or the email, and just move on to the next story. And when you finish that, submit it too. You just keep the stories out there in the submission process. Another one of my recommendations is, just keep it in the mail. It's a numbers game. The writer with the most stories in front of the most markets is gonna win. Even though we're not competing with each other, but the point of view of progressing your fiction career, you're going to win if you write a lot and keep them in front of markets.
So just on the submission there and keeping things in the mail, I have a big spreadsheet with just, what I have now, intellectual property assets, which are mainly longer, as I said. But, with short stories and also, sometimes the title of a short story, if you have lots, I imagine you're forgetting, like Dean talks about finding, all these short stories that he wrote. So do you have a spreadsheet, or do you recommend specific software, or how are you tracking all this different stuff?
Sure. So yes, you as you start to submit your stories, you have to keep track of where they are when you submitted them, because you just have to. So I have a huge spreadsheet, and it's basically all the markets down the left side and all my stories across the top. And then I have codes I put in terms of, an M in a date means I mailed it on that date. An R in a date means it was rejected on that date. An S in a date means it was sold on that date. And then I have lots of macros that summarize all that stuff for me. You have to... You don't want to be submitting a story again to a market that rejected it 2 years ago or something like that. So yeah, you do have to keep track of them. So I have a big spreadsheet because I like spreadsheets. There are submission trackers that you can use on the web. In the context of also mentioning some of the market lists that are out there. There's a market list called The Grinder. And I think the whole, just got to get on my screen, the whole URL is thegrinder.diabolicalplots.com. So if you go there, if you just Google The Grinder, you're going to find that website. Now, it's a good market list. It's free, so you can search for short fiction markets by genre. And it also has a submission tracker that you can use. While we're on the topic of market lists for science fiction, fantasy, for genre, Ralan.com, RALAN.com is, it's been around since I started writing. It's free. It's run by a writer in Denmark. He's an English writer, but lives in Denmark, called Ralan Conley. It's still a great one. And he breaks it out by pro markets and anthologies and semi-pro. You just need to look at pro and anthologies, in my view, if you take my advice of starting at the top. But somehow you have to find a way to track your submissions and the responses and the sales and everything, because you will get sales. So
yeah, exactly.
Plan ahead. So
and it's just interesting in the context of the changes in publishing in general with digital and the rise of indie, for example. It almost feels as if the short story market has stayed quite similar in the fact that the way of submission and the tracking and that's actually stayed more stable than maybe the rest of publishing. Do you see it being disrupted in any way, or have new markets emerged, or are those magazines at the top still the ones that you've been submitting to for years?
No, I have a bunch of email folders of the magazines that I've submitted to over the years, and I mean, it's in the hundreds, and there aren't hundreds around, or if there are, they're different ones. So what I saw in short fiction when I started in the late 1990s, when you were submitting your mail physically, snail mailing your manuscript in, the magazines were print only. And what you saw over the next decade was a steady decline in the number of those magazines, because print distribution, production and distribution is incredibly expensive. And as readership started dropping off, many of them went out of business. And then what we've seen in the last, I don't know, 5 years, probably started at least 5 years ago. A lot of the magazines finally embraced the ebook or the electronic revolution. So the ones that have stuck around, and a lot of the new ones that you see coming up, have electronic. Some of them are only electronic. A lot of the new ones are just online, or you might be able to purchase each issue as an ebook, etc. And usually, pretty well, all the big pro ones that I know of have electronic editions. So, it's reducing their costs. I haven't tried to buy a print magazine in a long time, so I don't know if I walked into some of the big stores around here, if I'd actually even be able to find them. But it's saved a lot of them, and what I've seen is an explosion in the number of markets and paying markets. There's probably more magazine markets now paying pro rates than there was when I started out. So I personally think it's a very healthy market for short fiction. It's another reason I encourage writers. You're going to find a lot of options for selling your work. You may find that when you sell it and it's published, you get to look at it online. You don't have something physical to hold in your hand, which always was cool when you got your contributor copies. But some of them are do both print and electronic, so you may get a print copy as well. I think it's once again become a thriving short fiction market.
Fantastic. Just a couple more questions. So you mentioned French. So what's the? Obviously you're Canadian, so maybe you're bilingual. No, but what about licensing for languages? Is that just something that people should watch out for in contracts, or you mentioned that earlier? What was the thing you wanted to mention?
Well, sometimes when you sell a short story, a magazine may actually ask for other language rights. If they're only publishing in English, you have every right to kind of ask them politely, why do you need those rights? I prefer to only give you English rights. Some of them have a valid reason. The big magazines like Asimov's and I think Fantasy and Science Fiction, they have standing agreements with some non-English magazines around the world, where those magazines will publish selected stories from the English editions. So that's a valid reason, but usually they don't need to ask for non-English rights. If you keep your foreign language rights, what you can do it now. I mean, if you have a story, you could send it to a French magazine, and without jeopardizing selling it in English, because you're not going to be giving away first English rights. You're going to be licensing first French language rights. What I do is that I've sold in, I get these mixed up, I think it's 26 languages in 32 countries. But what I do is I wait until I've sold the story in English, and then I submit to foreign language magazines. So you think of it as submitting reprints. They think of it as buying first rights. But from their point of view, they're more likely to want to buy a story from you if it appeared in a top English market. It cuts down their editorial, the slush pile reading. They're more likely that they're going to be reading a good short story. It sometimes helps by being able to put that on their cover that this first appeared in Analog or Asimov's, etc. So it's another market. This is another reason why I stress to writers that they have to understand licensing of their rights. don't give away rights you don't need to. Because if you sold a story and they took all the foreign language rights, you can't submit that to any foreign language market. And if you're looking for foreign language markets, by the way, if you go to my website, I keep a foreign language market list, foreign meaning non-English. So these are publications, magazines typically that you can submit to directly around the world, and you don't have to write in the language you submit in English. They have translators. They will translate your story into their language, and a lot of them are paying markets, so it's just like any reprint market. Even in English, it's found money for you, and it's a possibility to find other other readers for your work. Also, you might have some very cool things that happen. I sold a story to a French magazine, and the editor, it was one of my shapeshifter stories, so he loved that, and he bought 2 more from me. And then there's a great Canadian magazine called Solaris, and they only take submissions in French. Well, I don't write in French. But after I'd sold to the France French magazine, I was able to submit the French translation to the Solaris magazine, and they actually published those as well. And one of those led to one of my awards. So I actually got an award for a French story, which is
pretty cool.
Interesting, yeah. But even better, that magazine editor in France came back to me and said, if I ever have my small press that I want to put together, I'd love to publish a collection of your fantasy stories. And this was, 15 years ago, and I thought, well, that's very nice, but I didn't think anything would ever happen. But in 2010, he established his own small press, and he reached out to me, and hence I now have a French collection that was published in France, and was shortlisted for 2 awards in France. And that all came from, submitting one single short story to this editor way back when. So it's a way to broaden your readership, and just cool things may happen.
Yeah,
so it was a collection and an award that I got from submitting to one France magazine.
Which is so cool, and I think so often indie authors now just focus on quite established marketing techniques, whereas what's interesting with short stories is you improve your craft, you can get paid multiple times, and it can also be a marketing mechanism to find readers who are you're never going to reach in any other way, because they are traditional market readers. So I think it's awesome, and I always think, yes, I'm going to get into this, and then I back away, but you're helping me. I did want to ask one more question about on rights. Is the audio, because we're in this renaissance of audio. You and I are doing a podcast right now, so what about, is it worth trying to license audio rights or anthology audio rights, or podcast your own short fiction, or what are your thoughts on audio for short fiction?
First of all, good. It's another right, and that's back to rights again. Make sure when you're signing a short story contract that they don't grab audio rights, because it's one more thing that you can sell separately. And also a caveat is sometimes they might have an electronic version, like it might be a web-based magazine, so they'll ask for electronic rights. I always in the contract add excluding audio rights, because audio is electronic as well. So let's say you've done that and you have your backlist of short fiction. There are a lot of audio markets out there, certainly in science fiction and fantasy. Most of them pay. And the cool thing about them is that they prefer reprints. Most of them will prefer reprints. My point of view, it's a way to cut down on their slush pile editing. If they get something that's been published in a top pro market, they're going to say, okay, it's a good story. They'll still read it, but they can cut down a lot of their the work involved in going through a slush pile. And then if they buy it, most of them are paying. Some of them are $50, some of them are $100. They're usually, most of the audio markets I know are in that range. It's still found money. It's a story you've already sold, and it's just quite cool hearing someone read your story. The downside is I've had mostly good experience with narrators. I've had one story that was just awful. Just the narration was, it was just awful. They tried doing different voices and it didn't work. But then I've also had, my most recent one was just a beautiful narration of the short story that ties to my novel. So it was, okay, this is really good. So So it's fun. I'd say most cases you're going to have a wonderful experience. It'll be really cool to point your readers to someone narrating one of your stories, and you can find more readers that way too, because there are people who prefer audiobooks.
Mm-hmm.
So they will subscribe to these podcast magazines as well.
What about reading them?
It's great.
What about reading them yourself? Have you considered that?
I have. It's very time consuming. I have not got into doing like audiobook versions of my collections or my novel because it is very expensive. If you do it yourself, it's a major time commitment. I don't know if sort of I would have the voice. I would certainly know where to put the emphasis and on the prose because it's my own short fiction. That's one thing you can miss with a narrator, but it's a huge time commitment. So if I do go that route, I'm probably going to go the route of number of options. You can pay for a narrator directly. You can offer them royalties, and you can do a similar thing through something like a Audible. There's other audiobook publishers where they will cover some the technical skills of the narration and the production.
Yeah, fantastic.
But right now it's down my list, but I think for short fiction I definitely recommend that you submit to audio markets once you've sold it.
Brilliant. Well, we are out of time. So where can people find you and your books and stories and everything you do online? Smithwriter,
all one word.com. So SMITHWRITER.com. So that has everything and gives you links to all of my fiction, various retail outlets where you can buy it, subscribe to my newsletter. And subscribers get freebies. I give out a free ebook each month, short story ebook, and you get lots of new stuff and contests, and you can get a chance to be beta reader for novels and things like that. And follow me on Twitter. That's also on my website.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Doug. That was great.
Okay, and thank you, Joanna, for having me on. It's just been great. Appreciate it.